A review of Candida Moss's God's Ghostwriters, an important book about an often overlooked historical reality, but one buried under layers of speculation, cynical uncharitableness, unnatural verbiage, and awkward grammar. Published by Little Brown and Company, New York, Boston, London, God's Ghostwriters examines the role of enslaved and servile workers in the composition, transmission, copying, editing, and performance of the books that would become the New Testament. This topic is undeniably significant, as Christianity is historically tied to marginalized groups: slaves, women, children, the poor, the rejected, and the social outcast, including the ill and the criminal. Before reading this book, I had assumed these facts were well known, but Moss presents them as though they were startling revelations. Perhaps for her intended audience, these facts are obscure. The reality that the early Christian movement spread orally among these groups in back alleys, slave dens, and criminal hideouts, and that these people greatly contributed to and shaped the sacred texts, according to Moss, has been overlooked and suppressed. That said, while the book presents a valuable line of inquiry, its execution leaves much to be desired. Moss leans heavily on speculative claims, often presenting assumptions as established facts, choosing to write for a popular audience. The text frequently lacks the rigorous argumentation one expects from serious academic work, substituting historical evidence for ideological framing in a manner that may appeal to certain readers but alienates those seeking balanced scholarship. The prose is often awkward, riddled with jarring phrasing and convoluted grammatical constructions, making for an uneven reading experience. At times, it seems the author deliberately avoids a formal academic presentation, perhaps to sidestep the scrutiny that such an attempt would receive in peer-reviewed scholarship. Instead, she presents the worst possible case, which also happens to be the most emotionally manipulative. She aims to pull on the reader's heartstrings, to condemn early Christians. Ironically, this choice undermines the book's credibility rather than making it more accessible. There are moments where the narrative slips into a polemical tone, particularly in its framing of power, privilege, faith, and obedience, in a way that feels more beholden to contemporary ideological discourse than to a careful historical analysis of the ancient world. While Moss attempts to present the material in a way that resonates with modern concerns, particularly when discussing consent, choice, class, and power, her reliance on politically correct language, shaped by progressive academia, for example, enslaver rather than master and enslaved rather than slave, comes off more as rhetorical virtue signaling than a necessary linguistic update. In doing so, she bypasses the moral and theological implications of slavery, as understood by both biblical and patristic traditions. Early Christian conceptions of master-slave relationships were deeply complex and paradoxical, recognizing the absolute spiritual equality of all believers, while also acknowledging the harsh social inequalities of the time. This book fails to explore the nuances, preferring instead a one-dimensional perpetrator-victim framework that condemns rather than analyzes the complexities of ancient servitude and Christian responses to it. Given the book's framing and the author's apparent distaste for traditional Christian orthodoxy, I was surprised to find little in it that was new to me. As a practicing Catholic, the notion that Christianity is a religion of slaves, women, children, and the marginalized is not a radical revelation, but a well-established fact, attested to by church history, the lives of saints, and the writings of the church fathers. What the book presents as startling insights are in reality ideas that have long been understood by those familiar with Christian history and holy tradition. If anything, the book highlights how modern Protestant evangelicalism and secular academia have distanced themselves from Christianity's historical roots. Despite its shortcomings, God's Ghostwriters is not without value. The core subject matter, the role of servile labor, eunuchs, and slaves in the transmission of Christian texts, and the dynamics of slave-master relationships within a Christian context deserve deeper exploration than even this book provides. When Moss moves away from her rhetorical excesses and focuses on historical evidence, the book becomes more engaging and informative. Unfortunately, these moments are sporadic, and the overall presentation is weighed down by ideological baggage and inconsistent writing. Moss seems stuck between a Protestant perspective and a Western secular mindset. Her commentary, particularly in the final chapters, comes across as anti Catholic, especially her critique of the Catholic virtues of humility, poverty, chastity, and service, all of which Catholics see as central to the glory of God and living out the command to do good works. When examining this aspect, which she sections off from the rest of her book with an announcement, Moss's understanding of sainthood, the mystical body of Christ, and the militant suffering triumphant dynamic seems non existent. Again and again, she misses the Catholic and Orthodox both and reasoning, siding instead with a Protestant either or framework. She takes offense at mystical and symbolic religious language, and in condemning what she sees as intolerable injustices, loses sight of spiritual and theological meaning. This would not be as offensive if she acknowledged that she was engaging in the same type of apologetics as modern religious polemicists, except favoring the marginal, heretical, and rebellious over the majority, orthodox, and pious. Her lack of understanding of spirituality makes her approach more frustrating as she aligns herself with those who seek to reframe or dismantle orthodox and traditional belief. This is especially offensive when she dismisses Christian communities as participating in oppression simply for practicing their faith. She fails to see how Christian communities, many of whom have suffered colonialism, conquest, and expulsion, are often the very people who have been historically enslaved, repressed, and marginalized, blaming the victim for their choice of solve and hope. Moss's treatment of faithful believers is particularly grating. She seems to view Christians, especially those from non Western backgrounds such as Catholics and Orthodox, as ignorant, superstitious, obedient, and broken. Having grown up in a Southern Catholic community in a Latin dominant region, I was raised with an intimate understanding of spirituality, folk Catholicism, and cultural Christianity, which shapes a believer's everyday life. From migrant festivals to immigrant jubilees, faith is woven into the social fabric of my community. To see this dismissed as mere submission to oppression rather than recognized as a source of strength and identity reveals a profound lack of cultural awareness on Moss's part. Her contempt for the lived reality of faith, especially among those who are not privileged white academics from elite institutions, is unmistakable and unfortunate. Ultimately, I would rate this book a 4 out of 5, not because it is a flawless work, it is not, but because the topic itself and the evidence it does contain is significant and deserving of attention. However, the book would have been far more compelling had it embraced a more rigorous and less ideologically tinted approach. Readers willing to shift through the awkward prose and speculative leaps will still find valuable insights, but those expecting a well balanced, carefully argued historical analysis will be frustrated. Thank you and good night.